I was recently listening to a podcast where a chef was interviewed who's from the Hmong community. And he talked about the difference between sharing a meal with the Hmong community and sharing a meal in American culture. You know, in American culture, when you gather for a birthday or a Christmas dinner, often you might say as the host, hey, let me make you a plate. And so you'd get an individual plate and you'd put your loved one's favorite things on it, you know, a little bit of gravy, a little bit of mashed potatoes, a little bit of turkey, and you'd make a plate for the individual person. But he said in Hmong community, it's not so much about let me make you a plate. Instead, it's about setting a table of grace, a table that is overflowing with all the different dishes, and everybody kind of serves out of the same dishes and just receives the abundance. He talked about how in his culture, that abundance that is shared with one another is just ever so much more abundant than you could ever have an individual plate be. You know, when we take a little for each of us, there is less than when we share it at the table of grace. What he said about the table of grace and setting the table of grace made me think a lot about why I am Methodist. And one of the reasons I am United Methodist is because I believe in grace upon grace upon grace. In the Gospel of John chapter 1, it says, from his fullness we have received grace upon grace. And that's talking about how in Jesus Christ, the Word became flesh and lived among us. We have received overflowing, abundant grace, far more than we could ever ask for or imagine. Now, if grace to you sounds like a churchy buzzword or it's kind of lost its meaning because you've heard it so much, let me define it for you. Grace is love that is given by God freely and without price. We don't have to earn it, and there's nothing we could do to deserve any more or any less of it. Grace is just given because God is a God who gives love and gives it freely. God is love. And so God gives that love freely, and that no strings attached love is the grace of God. Now, the grace of God can come to us in many forms. Sometimes it comes to us because we're seeking it out. You know, if many of you might have had a moment like I did when I was 15 and I was on a youth retreat and I was in a really hard time in high school, and a lot of my friends were going through really awful things, a lot of mental health struggles and self-harm, and I was really struggling. And in the midst of this youth retreat, I felt God move in my spirit in a way that made me feel drawn to God like never before, and like I could really trust in God. John Wesley, the founder of Methodist, when he had this kind of experience, he said, I felt my heart strangely warmed. And that kind of grace, the fancy theological word for it is justifying grace. In other words, grace can sometimes take the form of making it seem like, now me and God, we've clicked into place. What was wrong is now right, and me and God, we're good again. That grace has accomplished forgiveness in my life that I could never earn. And so now I stand before God forgiven and whole because of all that Christ has done for me. That's grace. But that's only one form of grace. That justifying grace, that's that one piece of grace with the forgiveness piece. But I think grace can come to us in much more ways than that. There's also something called prevenient grace. And prevenient it's like preventing, it's like preventative. Prevenient means coming before you're even aware of it. I think about young people who I see coming up in their faith and they don't quite have the language for their faith, or they haven't quite put words on God, or they haven't quite accepted God into their lives, but I can see God at work in them. God is at work in them, shaping them and teaching them and molding them, giving them a sense of justice and what is right and wrong in this world. That is the prevenient grace of God. That is the grace of God, God's love and compassion and care for our young people, shaping them and molding them. No strings attached. That is called prevenient grace. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you think about sanctifying grace. Maybe you've already had that experience of accepting Jesus Christ and receiving God's forgiveness, but you continue throughout your whole life long, you still need God. You still need God and God's grace and God's forgiveness and God's compassion guiding and teaching you your whole life long. That's called sanctifying grace. And no matter how old you get, no matter how long you've been a Christian, we all need the grace of God to continue making us more and more like Jesus. That's what sanctifying means. Sanctifying is a fancy word for to make more holy, to sanctify. And so that just means we're becoming more and more like Jesus. Now, in Methodism, in our theology, this is called the way of salvation. And you might think of it initially as a pretty linear process, right? Like before you're aware of God, you receive prevenient grace. I think about like a baby being baptized and they don't even know what's happening. God's prevenient grace is with them. And then at a certain point in your life, you experience justifying grace. I think about like a teenager through confirmation or through a youth retreat saying yes to God. And then for the rest of your life, sanctifying grace is shaping and molding you. It could be very linear like that, right? Before I know, now I come to know God. And then for the rest of my life, I know that God is shaping and molding me. But John Wesley knew, and I know, and you know, life is not that simple and not that clean. So many of us, every single day, God works in ways that we don't even understand or imagine. Before we are even aware, God is preparing a way for us in every circumstance in our life. And every moment of the day, God is working to make us more like Christ if we would just open our eyes and our ears and our hearts and our minds to what God is doing. And when we have those moments where we just wander so far off the path, it is always that justifying grace of God that comes alongside us like the Good Shepherd to guide us back to the path that God has given for us. Now, if you're asking yourself, okay, this sounds great. I love grace. I love love. That sounds amazing. I want that. I hope you'll stay tuned for our next episode of this Why UMC series. Because while grace is freely given by God, it's not something you have to earn or work for. There are certain ways in our tradition that we know we can access God's grace. And those are called the means of grace. So I'll see you next time on Why UMC as we talk about how to access that grace upon grace. And until then, may the grace of God be with you. Amen.